Hey guys, let's say that we were asked to multiply an expression and it looked something like this. X minus, and we have our parentheses, negative 6 plus 5i, parentheses, bracket. X minus a negative 6 minus 5i. Now, this can look a bit confusing. It can look scary for some of us. But I want to, before we jump into this, I want to remind us of a rule that we have when we multiply binomials. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that rule and we're going to apply this to this expression and hopefully cut down on a few steps that we have here. Okay, so let me come over to the side. I want us to remember or think about what happens when we multiply an expression that is in the form of a minus b times a plus b. This means, we have the first two terms in each binomial are the same. The last terms here are the same. The only difference is one has a plus sign, one has a minus sign. So let's look at what happens when this occurs. A times a, that I realize some students do not know what the FOIL method is. FOIL stands for FOIL. That stands for first, outer, inner, and last. So when I say first, I multiplied the first two terms in the binomial together. A times A gives us A squared. My two outer terms, A times B, gives me, that's positive, plus AB. My two inner terms, my I, is negative b times a. That's going to give me minus ab. And then my two last terms here, that's going to be a negative b times a positive b. That's going to give us a negative b squared. So let's look and see what happens here. Every time, I don't care how many times you do this, what type of numbers or terms you have in this expression, if it is in the form of a minus b times a plus b, what will happen every time is these two inner terms here will cancel out. If you notice, I have a plus ab and a minus ab. Those are opposites of one another. They will cross out. And what I'm going to be left with here is a squared minus b squared. All right, and that's what we call a difference of squares. So when we are multiplying two binomials that have the same terms in there, the only difference happens to be one has a plus sign and the other has a minus sign. There's different ways we could look at this, but this is the way I choose to explain it. Our shortcut here is that we don't have to do the entire distributive property. This FOIL method is just our distributive property. It's a little acronym that helps us remember each step of that distributive property. But when we have binomials in this form, we can just skip the outer step, skip the inner step, because they're going to be opposites of one another every single time, and just multiply the first and last term. Okay, hold on to that information. So here's what we're going to do, wonderful math people. We're going to take this expression here and we're going to manipulate it so that we can use that rule that I just showed you there. Now see, right now, I have our first terms are the same. My last terms are the same. But the problem here is that these signs are not opposites. Now, and I'm going to write it up here to remind you that, we have to have the first terms are the same, second terms are the same, but one's going to be positive, one's going to be negative. So at this point, I cannot use that rule that we were just talking about just a few seconds ago. Let's just leave this here, and I will erase these that I circled here because I don't want to mess up anything. Okay, but here's what we're going to do. I am going to distribute this negative, and I'm going to distribute this negative through those parentheses, and then I'm gonna fall back onto my associative property, where we just, move my parentheses and just make it look a little bit different. So just follow me here. I'm going to leave my bracket. I'm going to drop that x down. And what I'm going to do is multiply that negative times that negative. That's the way I'm going to look at it. Negative times a negative gives me a positive. So that's going to be plus 6. And then that negative times a positive gives me a negative. So that's going to be minus 5i. I'm going to close my bracket. On my second bracket here, I'm going to drop that x down, and I'm going to distribute that negative. A negative times a negative gives me a positive. Then a negative times a negative gives me a positive. So I'm going to have plus 5i. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift those parentheses from where they were before. Before I had parentheses around the last two terms. Now, I'm just going to stick some parentheses in here around that x plus 6. And now, if you look at what I have, if I were to look at this in terms of A and B, I can now say that my A terms, I'm going to just use x plus 6. I know it's more than one number. We're used to just seeing a term, but we're going to let the whole expression just represent A. Okay, x plus 6 is my A. My B is going to be 5i. And now I have that minus and that plus sign. They have opposite signs there. So now, guys, I can fall back on this rule that we discussed just a few minutes ago. So I could go through my entire distributive property, but I'm not. I don't have to. I only need to complete my first terms, and because my first terms, is actually an expression, I have to just multiply these two together. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to write this as x plus 6. I apologize. I'm going to write that as x plus 6 all squared. And then I'm going to multiply my last two terms together. Negative times a positive gives me a negative. 5 times 5 gives me 25i squared. Okay, now at this point, I have multiplied those two terms. But now there are a few things here that we need to simplify. And depending on your knowledge and how much you understand about i's and squaring binomials, you might can skip these next few minutes. But if you don't really know how to simplify this and you have trouble with that, just hang around and we will work this out together, okay? So for x plus 6 all squared, again, you can do the FOIL method. But once we get so far in math, we want to make sure that we are working efficiently and that, we can get answers without wasting our time, for lack of better words. So we have a expression that we can follow every time we want to square a binomial that is in the form of a plus b squared. The expression will always be a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. If this is not something that you already know, and I'm going to use my glittery looking pen here. If this is not something that you already know, please write this down, put it in a box, highlight it, because it will save you a lot of time. Now, using that information, what I'm going to do is square x plus 6. So my first term will be, let's color coordinate this. My first term comes from squaring the first term in the parentheses. So a squared is a result of squaring a. So my first term, it will come from squaring x, so it will be x squared. Now that middle term there, 2ab, what I'm going to do is multiply the first term in that parentheses times the last term in the parentheses and then double it. Okay, well, my first term in my parentheses is x. My second one is 6. So x times 6 is 6x. Double that. that gives me 12x. And let's just go back to yellow. My last term, b squared, is a result of squaring that last term in the parentheses there. So my last term in my parentheses here is 6. Square 6, that gives me a positive 36. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down that minus sign because up here I have minus 25i squared. I'm going to drop down that minus sign, drop down that 25, and I want to make sure that we all understand what this I squared is. So, guys, that is the same thing as the square root of -1. Now, I haven't did a video on this, and if I need to explain I in more detail, let me know and we can address that. But I squared, let's look and see what happens when if I square I. If I square I, let's put parentheses around this. I squared, oops, I apologize. Sometimes my iPad wants to act up. I squared will be equal to, well, the square root and that square there, those are like inverses of one another, right? They're opposites, whatever you want, whatever word you want to use, but they're just going to undo one another. And what you're going to be left with is this -1. So what the point that I'm making here is that every time you see I squared, we're going to replace that I squared with -1. So instead of putting 25i squared, I'm going to put 25 times -1. And what that ends up being here, and you can look at this a number of different ways. I have -25 times -1, which gives me a positive 25. So I have x squared plus 12x plus 36 plus 25. And my last step here is to combine like terms. I have that 36 plus that 25. And if I add that, 6 plus 5 gives us 11. Then that is going to give us 61. So I end up with x squared plus 12x plus 61. Guys, that was a lot of work, and it could have been a bit shorter, but I wanted to make sure that we understood all of the parts, all of the moving parts here. But if you have any questions, if there's anything here that is unclear, don't hesitate to reach out. I am happy to help.